Hey everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker we have for you today, Chair of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party, Bill James. Bill has spent years leading the local Central Committee meetings and helping draft, create, and endorse proposed resolutions and amendments. In addition, Bill has committed himself to ensuring diversity within the government and politics by making sure that individuals are represented on the basis of sex, gender, race, and more. Furthermore, Bill has committed himself to making sure that youths like ourselves always have a voice at the table. Feel free to private chat me if you have any questions you'd like to ask Bill, and I'll read that off during the Q&A. So, without further ado, here is Bill James.
Thank you, Mir. It must have been very exciting as I actually physically moved in and out of the field of my camera. I was helping somebody in my home here. So as Mir said, I'm Bill James. I'm the chair of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party. And I know Mir because he's an intern, a longtime intern, an intern leader in our Democratic Party intern program. And that's a very great program, which I recommend to you. I've been asked to talk today a little bit about politics and data privacy and kind of the ethics around all of that. And I know a little bit about that because, of course, we use a lot of data in the course of our work for the Democratic Party. And we use the data to reach out to voters. And so voters are sometimes very surprised when someone calls them and they say, how did you get my number? Or they get a bunch of mail, of course, tons of mail, and they wonder how you got their address. And the answer is that if you are a campaign, and you don't have to do a whole lot to qualify as a campaign, but if you're a campaign or a candidate, you can get the voter file from the registrar of voters in the jurisdiction in which you're running, or in all the jurisdictions in which you're running. You can do that for all relatively nominal cost. So for example, if you go down to the registrar yourself for a couple of $100s, you fill out an application and they'll give you a thumb drive or a download with a data file for your jurisdiction. Now there's some limitations. So we're the Santa Clara County Democratic Party, so we can get the entire county data file. But a candidate for, let's say, Sunnyvale City Council would only be able to get the Sunnyvale part of the file. Also, you can't just say, I'm a random citizen and I'm interested in having this data. You have to have a justification that's to their satisfaction. So we're a formal political party, and every campaign cycle, we do political work, valid political work in every jurisdiction in the county. So we're able to get the full list. You can get it for other purposes. You can get it for academic research, for example. Obviously, there's some things you can't get it for. You can't use it for commercial purposes. You can't resell the data. And there's a bunch of other things that you're not permitted to do. But some things get a little bit complicated. So for example, we'll sometimes get this data directly from our from the registrar of voters, but more commonly campaigns and political parties and political committees working on campaigns or on issues will get access to this data through private data services. So the private data services also get an upload and updates of data from the registrar of voters, but then they enhance that data with data they get from other places. And you know that it sounds like you're a group that will be well aware of the sort of ways in which they collect that. You know, all of the cookies that every place you visit on the web might come into play, and all of whatever might be gleaned from your public social media posts. Sometimes the information is gleaned from people that are secondary. So you don't, you might think I have very good practices, so I'm careful to keep my social media private, or I'm careful not to discuss politics on my social media. But these algorithms, to the extent that you do have anything public, will make inferences from what you have public and might enrich this data based on that information. And then finally, a tricky thing is that other people get inducements to share information about you. And so some of the political tools, for example, are sort of social political outreach. And so a tool will say, you're a supporter of the Measure N campaign. I'm making that letter up. And we want you to upload your contacts from all these different places that you have contacts. And then we'll match those as well as we can to voter files. And we'll let you send an email saying, I'm your friend, or I know I'm your contact, I support Measure N. Well, all that data gets sucked up, and depending on the platform and the terms of use and what all the boxes you check when you go to use it, that data might get incorporated into their data in some way. So one thing about political use of data is that we always use data in a basic sense to reach out to voters. We knock on doors, we call voters, we text voters, we send emails to voters. But all of these things are subject to initially subject to the restriction that they have to be for the limited purpose that the registrar or some official body or some vendor that has permission through the official body has obtained permission. Unfortunately, I think that one of the ways that that data leaks out, like privacy is lost in the political process, are through these secondary and tertiary uses of data and the enhancement of data. So once a company takes that data from the registrar and starts adding its own data to it and correlating it to data from people's, grocery store shopping coupon use, they feel that that's proprietary to them. And there's this whole question of, well, who owns that information? Is it the people whose privacy is invaded by the fact that, they are inferring that you're going to vote for Democrats because you eat Wheaties and never eat Frosted Flakes? That's a valid question, and one that the last couple of decades, I think, of development of political use of data has really highlighted. So we try to be careful in our use of data as a political party because we have a brand, right? So we don't want any voters to say the Democratic Party. Some guy came to my door trying to sell me vacuum cleaners, and he said he got the information about me from the Democratic Party. So we're careful about who we share it with, but to do what we need to do, we do have to expose data to things like our vendors, and we expose data in varying degrees to our volunteers. And so you follow principles and best practices to try to limit that exposure. So for example, for a given volunteer who's going to walk in one neighborhood in one town, you might give them a list of things, but it might not include all of the fields of data that are available to you, just the ones that they need to go to where they're going. And then you might make sure that you collect the data afterwards. That's an old example. In the old days, we printed these lists. More commonly now, the information would be on an app, right? So the data fields would be presented to them on an app, and they'd only see one at a time, and they wouldn't be able to download a list at all. And then they enhance the data by entering answers to questions. The person wasn't home, the person moved, the house isn't there anymore. The person said, yeah, I'm all for Measure N. In fact, I'm going to donate money to Measure N, or you can put up a sign in my yard. And then over time, the political data industrial complex learns more and more about people, and their algorithms infer additional information about them. So I know that some regimes of regulation of privacy are pretty strict, are different in the United States. Really, the perspective is different. In the US, the idea is that if you're giving data to somebody who's a provider to you, you kind of implicitly mean for them to use it to provide at least that service. And then if they're careful to get your permission, they might be able to use it to provide closely adjacent services. That's your relationship with the party to whom you give the data directly. Like in our case, the data we're using initially is given by voters to the registrar of voters so that they can vote. And they don't really have much choice in that, right? Well, as it turns out, when you go to register a vote, you do have to provide certain information that political parties and campaigns don't see, like your driver's license number or some other kind of identifying information. But if you give if you give an email address, and if you give a phone number, which are not required, then those items are available to campaigns. And that's why people get unexpected messages, text messages, and email messages. Now, ethical considerations come into play because one of the requests that I get very commonly as the Democratic Party chair is from an allied organization that says, look, we're the Californians to deal with the climate crisis. And we want your list because if you give us your list, we'll merge it with our list and we'll reach more people. And those are tough calls because a good number of the people on our list might be happy to be on the list of the California climate crisis group, but you don't really know their practices. They might give their list to somebody else that those other people don't like. So you probably know that there is a regime of regulation of communications, the CAN-SPAM regime. And so there's an open question about political parties and campaigns as to whether they have to comply with those requirements. So if you're sending commercial email, you have to be pretty careful that you're sending the email to somebody who has opted in to getting email from you. And you definitely have to be careful that it's not somebody who's opted out of getting email from you. Political campaigns and parties are probably exempt from those requirements under the First Amendment. But we really, as a matter of constituent relationships and member relationships between us and the members of the Democratic Party, we try to observe those interactions and we try to observe those norms because consumers of emails expect them to be observed. So, for example, if we send mass emails out, like beyond to a small group of people, we send it via a service that includes an unsubscribe button. But the problem with that approach is this concept of affiliated entities. So another common question I get as Democratic Party chair is, can you please get people to stop sending me so much political mail? I don't want to get any more political mail. Or can you at least stop them from sending me email? I'm tired of the Democrats sending me email. I don't want any more email. And so we can verify that a user is unsubscribed from our service, and we can know that they won't be emailed if they're unsubscribed from our service, at least by us through that service, because that's a feature of the service that will prevent that from happening. But if during an election season, we contract with a third-party vendor to send 10,000 emails about a subject, they're going to be sending it through their own service, and the previous unsubscribe won't work unless we've found a way to merge that data into the data set that's being used to send that later communication. So even when you try, it can be hard to really honor things. And there is nothing like the mobile phones. It doesn't really seem to work very well anymore. The mobile phones have this do not call registry where you can say, I don't want to be called by people who don't know me. I don't want unsolicited phone calls. But there again, you have the First Amendment problem. So politicians can probably do it anyways and not have that law enforced against them. And as to like emails and even I think text messages, there's no universal do not do this to me registry, and there's certainly no effective one. So if you don't want to get political emails ever, let's say you use your email for your business and you can't have it cluttered by that, it's not really that easy to turn off. And it's just like commercial mass emails. You have to unsubscribe diligently from every place that you find information. So the other thing I tell people to do is to vote, because a good thing about modern technology as it relates to data is that all the campaigns know pretty quickly when you've already voted. And then once you've voted, you're no longer a target for them. They're wasting their money by sending you mail, and they're wasting their money even by sending you electronic mail, and they don't want to pay for that. So the way to create kind of a financial interest in the part of these campaigns to not sending you information is to vote early in the cycle because it'll take you off of everybody's lists. So a couple other things that happen with data. One is a little bit about contributions. So Democrats have been very big advocates of transparency and financing of campaigns. And it's a great thing that increasingly, without as much trouble as you used to have to do, you can find out whose money is really behind the campaigns that you're looking at. So for example, if a candidate doesn't quite sound right and you're suspicious of them and they seem like they're good, but then they say a couple things that make you wonder about them, you can look into public filings online now and figure out who's been giving them money and how much and what they're spending it on. And that's really generally a very good thing. The problem is it's the same thing as cookies over time. Basically somebody can accumulate a profile of you by looking at your contributions over time. So if you go to opensecrets.org, they mostly miss the state filings. But if you go to opensecrets.org, you can put in the name of a person you know, like me. And you'll miss me if you put Bill James, but if you put William James, then you'll see William James is a common name. So there's a bunch of them, but I'm not the one in Florida. And you'll see there's a couple of others. And you can get a sense of some of the things that I've given money to. And so that's the sort of thing people use that data. So for example, in my town, there's a city council candidate who's presenting herself as being kind of a nice person and a good person, but her opponents have dug up and found that she'd given non-trivial, I mean, like maxed amounts of dollars to Donald Trump's campaigns, and people in my neighborhood don't like that. So that's being kind of used against her. So I think that's kind of fair because it's recent and inconsistent with the story that she's telling. But if you think about yourselves as young people and the signal that you'll generate over time, all of that stuff is public, and basically, unlike in Europe where you can kind of get some things forgotten about you, in the US, our paradigm doesn't really have that. It doesn't support that. So things just kind of accumulate, and the story is written about each of us as public information like that is created. I want to leave enough time for questions, and so I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about, but I'm just going to mention one other because it has these ethical implications. All campaigns use data now to target communications. So here's a basic one that you think everybody will agree is not inappropriate. So one of the fields of information from the registrar's voters office is your political party registration. So if you have registered as a Democrat, then our party is more likely to send you a communication that says our Democratic Party endorses candidate X or measure Y. And that way, we are not turning off like independent or Republican or Green or Libertarian voters who might have other reasons to support that same candidate and might not be impressed that they're supported by the Democratic Party. And so that's one area of targeting. But increasingly, especially in a very multi-ethnic area like our area, campaigns are targeting communications by gender, and they're also targeting by race. And so you have a city council race in San Jose between a Vietnamese American office holder and a non-Vietnamese candidate trying to challenge that office holder. And both campaigns make judgments about whether to communicate to Vietnamese American households and very carefully how to communicate to them. And I think that opens up a lot of questions about at what point does that become problematic. And then you all know about the data analytics stuff. That's more sort of modeling and projecting and guessing what people will be interested in, what information. We do that because when you advertise like on Facebook, you have to create an audience and you have to target it in some way. And they give you various fields that you can define to do that, including this is somebody likely to engage with liberal political content. This is somebody who's this demographic. This is a woman who's age 56 and older. And then they get into some pretty specific things that you start to wonder, how do they know? Well, they've got profile information and they see everything you write, whether it's public or not. They see it, their algorithm sees it. And so they know, and so there again, a certain version of truth and information and advocacy is being presented to certain users, and based on attributes of those users. But those users don't know that, right? They don't know you're seeing this ad because we think you're over 56 and a woman. They don't know that, and it raises a question as to whether maybe they're being manipulated, and maybe they should be told what targeting was used to result in the message being sent to them, so that they know what filter to apply in considering it. So there's all this data that's in use, and there's no like unknowing the technology. There's no losing the data that's been accumulated over time. I think it's a question of responsible use of it. And then questions, especially for young people, about how, should there be some concept of information about you not being remembered for so long, so that there's just not this kind of continually evolving and individualized model of who you are and what you're going to respond to. And I'd say that because we don't really have those rules yet, the advice that I would give is to be skeptical of the information that's presented to you. Don't assume you're seeing information that's generally available or generally being submitted, and don't assume that it's consistent with information that's being presented to others. And so going to the information yourself and to sources that you trust, I think, to validate things is an important principle. And I'm going to stop there in the interest of time and answer any questions you may have, because you don't always get political party chair to answer your questions. By the way, I've done this since 2017. I was elected first in January of 2017. And it wasn't until this election cycle, which is contentious locally and nationally for a number of reasons, that I was called a party boss. And so you have a chance now to question a political party boss. Mary, did you get any questions?
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. We'll be transitioning to a Q&A now, as Bill said. As a reminder, feel free to private chat me with any questions and I'll read them off. So The first question is, do you think that targeted political advertising based on collected personal data is problematic in causing a political echo chamber?
Yeah, it definitely is because it's easy. The reason is this: if you're doing a national television ad and you have no idea who's going to see it, and you can turn off as many voters as you activate, but if you know that you're targeting narrowly to people who have indicated that they like Sean Hannity, you can go to extremes in communicating to that audience. So just as the atomization of the news stations happened through the rise of talk radio and through cable TV, you can target it very, very individually, and you can start to push people's very individual specific buttons. You might know that this is a Vietnamese American of a certain generation who likely came from the old country in connection with the big war against the communists. And you can manipulate that person, and I use manipulate in the political sense of trying to get them to do the thing you want them to do in a different way than a young Vietnamese American or a non-Vietnamese American. And I think that, people say more extreme things when they're in smaller groups where they feel more secure that the extreme message is going to resonate.
Okay, so the next question is, what was the point of the Tump app?
Of which?
I'm not quite sure. Sorry, the Tump app?
I don't know that one.
No worries. Okay, so we can move on to the next question. How did you react to the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, and what was the response to making sure that data breaches would be prevented in the future?
So yeah, we didn't talk about data breaches. The other thing that you have to do when you are a collector of data information is, and this is required, if you go to the Santa Clara County Registrar of Voters, if you look at the very long agreement, one of the things they want to know is how you're going to hold this data, because they're trying to make sure that you at least have something to say to that. And I'm going to keep it on a computer that has a password, at least that. So I talked a lot about sort of authorized users of data. And, there's this company, Palantir, used to be in Palo Alto. Has anybody heard of it? I feel like a Democratic Party chair, so I've protested at their doors about their big contracts with the CIA. And there's a lot of money in data, but that's been going on at least since before 9/11. And so that's 20 years or more, where data is being mass crunched by the government, and they're doing it ostensibly for the reason of trying to detect things that are anomalies that could indicate terrorist activity. Sounds like a worthwhile thing, but they're literally hoovering into this data system everything they know about everybody, and then crunching it to try to decide who the bad actors are. And there's all these really badly done movies about the government snatching people off the streets because their algorithms have decided that they're bad people or invalid people in some way. And that would almost be funny if there weren't unmarked vans driving around Portland actually snatching people off the street for some reason. So we need to be very concerned about that. I don't think we've learned really anything from any of that. I think that when we hear in the news about state actors looking to manipulate our body politic, I think that they have all of these models at their disposal. They're able to crunch this data. I think the systems they're fairly soft systems, hold a lot of data about us. And so they're maybe not getting into the government database directly, but they're able to get at things like social media feeds and such that let them formulate their own and create their own models and use those to manipulate us. And it's frustrating to me because honestly, I had to go through a lot of hoops to get our party qualified as an official advertiser on Facebook, and so that we can do political ads. And they're trying through this regime to have there be some kind of check that you really exist and that you have a phone and an address. They want to mail you a card. But it was ridiculous to me to have to go through so much trouble to qualify as an advertiser when I know that 10 million, more than 10 million accounts on Facebook are resources that are controlled by state actors to manipulate our politics, and they have no idea. So they don't advertise, they don't pay Facebook to advertise for some candidate, but they're reposting and retweeting nonsense that they know based on psychology and data science is going to activate a certain number of people in a certain way.
So the next question is, This is somewhat tangential to the topic you were discussing, but how can we limit the overreach of the government in regards to reading citizens' personal data? Is dismantling the Patriot Act possible or even reasonable?
So I think that this is the kind of thing, there's the war between Apple and the government about iPhone encryption, right? Whether there should be a place of privacy that even the government can't get into and see. I think Europe has this more right than the United States. Europe has the idea that that things about you shouldn't be remembered for long or forever, certainly, without your permission. And I think having the government or big corporations or anybody else accumulating this whole body of information about us, a bunch of information that they never otherwise would have had access to without violating what then would have been understood to be our constitutional rights, like without coming into our homes or bugging us or tapping our phones or stealing documents out of our home. I think that those principles need to be extended in some meaningful way to provide more protection, both from corporate users and from government. And the European regulations, they really annoy companies. It's expensive to comply with them and to demonstrate compliance. But I think that the bias is, listen, you're making a lot of money off of this, or in the case of the government, you're exercising a lot of power through this, and individual people have this right. But some basic things like a person should be able to know what somebody knows about them and to be able to click some boxes and tell them to forget it, and they don't want them to know that anymore. And we don't have anything like that in the US.
So it looks like we'll only have time for 2 more questions. So I guess the next one is, do you think the use of data will increase significantly in politics for the foreseeable future?
I think it will, and I think that I think that because it's a pretty competitive business, people get power in some realm that's meaningful to them by winning elections, and other people make money by getting paid by people in power to help them win elections. And because data science-based advocacy and manipulation works, those actors will push that envelope further and further. And I think that it will, create a pressure, I think, to have a conversation about what's appropriate and about putting limits.
Okay, so the next question is, what do you think about an international organization like the UN controlling and protecting user data?
I think that anybody, first of all, data is a lot of power. And so I like the UN in general. I trust the UN as an institution, and especially its sort of it's non-governmental type of activities, I think, are generally well done and staffed by people who are the best people in terms of what the ability and what's in their heart. But I think that that kind of repository can be so, it creates so much power that we have to be careful about thinking whether concentrating things would be better than having them spread around. I think a better thing would be having a change in the idea about who owns data. Companies now think that they own data because they've accumulated it. And I think we should really focus more on that data is about us and of us. And so it really is ours, and we should be able to exercise some control over it. I think individuals would do a better job of guarding their own privacy than any company or NGO would.
Okay, so it looks like we have a litany of questions, but we only really have time for one more. So would it be okay if I put your email in the chat? And
Oh yeah, that's certainly.
Okay, so the last question is, what do you think are the differences and pros and cons between the government having control over data and large corporations having that control?
Well, I might have answered this question, and this is a nonpartisan setting, so I'm not trying to be partisan, but I will say I would have answered that question differently, perhaps 4 or 10 years ago. I think we've seen some government actors that had well-deserved reputations for impartiality and nonpartisanship. And I think we've seen some of them kind of broken down a little bit. And you think about the Justice Department and the FBI and even and even the State Department. So I think that should give us all pause to think about, well, would we want the government to have so much control over our data? But I also don't want big corporations to have too much power either. And so I honestly don't mind that when I'm flipping through a social media feed, I get shown an ad for socks because I've been looking for socks on the internet. I'm going to get an ad anyways, and so I just ignore that one like all the rest. But I do think that we need more control as individuals, whether government holds data or companies. I think we need more control to be able to say enough. We want to have a little more privacy than this.
Thank you so much for coming, Bill. It was amazing to hear from you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all. Thank you all for caring about such interesting policy issues. And as Mir said, you can drop my my email address in the chat. So if I didn't get to your question, or if a question occurs to you later, feel free to reach out. So.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to miss this chance. Those of you who are old enough, I hope you're registered and I hope you'll vote. It's not too late. If you're going to be 18 by November 3rd, you can just show up at the vote center and vote.
Yep. So I guess I'll hand it off to Krish now. He has a quick announcement and then we'll have a short break.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much, Bill.